Okay, so then you might ask yourself, you organize your perceptions in relationship to your goals, and then you might ask yourself, well, where do those goals come from? You know, and we've heard from thinkers like, say, Freud, who talked about the id functions, and the id is sort of the seat of primordial impulses, right? And so you might think about the id as the producer of primary goals or drives, and Freud did think about them as drives, so they were things that led to, you know, a relatively rigid behavioral algorithm once the state had arisen. Now, as I mentioned before, I think that that's a flawed viewpoint, because the motivational state is more than merely a drive, because a drive is something that, say, triggers a pre-programmed sequence of behaviors. And a lot of the early behaviorists thought about animal behavior in that way, right? They'd say the animal would encounter a stimulus, and the stimulus would produce a response, and then the responses would get chained together, and then when the animal encountered the stimulus again, then just those chained responses would automatically run. And one of the famous experiments that showed that that was wrong was a rat was trained to run through a maze. You could sort of train a rat pretty quickly if, you know, you put him in the maze and there's like, he can go this way or this way, and you put some cheese over here. You do that 3 or 4 times, the rat learns to turn right, and then you add another piece to the maze, and, you know, then the rat learns to turn left, and so you can get it turning, you know, in an extremely complicated way to walk through the maze. But then what they did was they took a rat, and they wrapped up its hind legs, you know, like with tape, so it couldn't use them, and then they put its little rear end on a cart, and then they had the little rat scoot through the maze on the cart. And it's obvious that a scooting rat and a running rat don't use the same motor output, not even close, and the rat could still get through the maze. So the idea that all the rat had done was chain together learned automatic responses turned out to be wrong. Rats, it's more like rats learn what's going on and can generalize from it just like you do. So anyway, so the notion that the drive just instantiates a sequence of pre-programmed behaviors, in most cases, in many cases, especially with complex behavior, turns out to be wrong. There's some limited circumstances under which it's right. Okay, so the first hypothesis we're going to entertain is the idea that you have to frame the world in order to interact with it. And this is sort of a little mythological diagram that I whipped up a long time ago. And the bottom thing, that's an Ouroboros, by the way, which is a dragon that eats its own tail. It's an ancient symbol of chaos. And chaos is what you see when you don't know what you're looking at. And so you could say, in some sense, chaos is all the complexity that surrounds you that could possibly intrude on your little safe world. And then, to grasp that chaos, or to operate within it, you have to put it within a framework. And so, that's the great father there, that's actually God. You see, and God's got the sun behind him, because God is like the sun. He's, you know, reliable, and he's associated with consciousness, and then he's sort of ruling over this city. And so for me, that was a good symbol of culture. And in part, culture is what's outside of you. But in part, culture is also the frameworks that you've learned to use by being with other people. The frameworks that you've learned to use to narrow and specify the world. And in my mode of thinking, the framing is associated with security on the one hand, because it tells you what you can do, and, you know, makes things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control, and, you know, it can start to get too rigid. Whatever. Regardless of the pros and cons of framing, if you see something one way, then you can't see it another. It's harder to see it another. So that's the con side of framing. The pro side of framing is, well, then you get to do something. If it's unframed, you're in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead at all. So you have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really, in some sense, you even have to oversimplify them. It depends on what you mean by that. But what you're really trying to do is to never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So, how do you frame things? Well, the first thing we should point out is that a lot of framing doesn't even happen psychologically. Right? So here you are sitting in this classroom, and you're not overwhelmed by chaos. Well, why? Well, first of all, you're in a city. That's helpful. There's electricity here, and there's natural gas. and there's people to fix all the plumbing, and so the fact that you're in a city makes life much simpler right off the bat. There's nothing trying to eat you. You don't have to contend with the fact that it's like -20 for 3 months, and so that's a whole bunch of complexity that the civilized world is just taken care of for you. And then, now you're in the university in the city, and that eliminates a whole bunch of other hassles, There's some things you have to do, but there's a bunch of things you don't have to do, and then you're inside this building, and, well, look at that, there's electric light here, and, and the chairs work, and there's not going to be an earthquake, and probably the whole building isn't going to fall down. So, by the time you're sitting in your chair here, also with your clothing on, you've screened a lot of complexity out already, and so you can sit there fairly calmly. And so that's all external. Now, part of the reason, and this is worth thinking about, because this isn't only psychological. You guys will hear a fair bit about terror management theories as you progress through your education. And so terror management theories are theories that attempt to account for why people are, say, patriotic in their beliefs, why they adopt belief systems. And the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. And so Freud sort of said that about religious systems. That was his critique of religion. People are afraid of death, and so they have this infantile desire to have that fear go away, so they turn to religion, and religion says, well, death isn't permanent, and that's why people are religious. And the extension of that is, well, that's also why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against this deep, shaking anxiety. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your culture, say, if you identify with it, you're patriotic or whatever it is, or you think that your culture is worth defending, you're not just defending something psychological. It's like the culture, the functioning culture keeps the lights on. So it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. It also protects you from death. And that's even more important most of the time than being protected from death anxiety. Now, there's a psychological component to it too, but you don't ever want to underestimate just the practical utility of being nested inside, what Piaget would consider a relatively functional game. It's like, your world's a lot simpler. You have to work to maintain it and everything, and that's kind of a drag, maybe. That's the tyrannical element of it, but, the payoff's